Hi everybody, this is the last set of slides recording for this week. As a reminder, this will be on, or some of this material will be on your midterm next week, so please make sure you review this and take notes. So we've looked at three of the four major tissues in the human body, the epithelial, muscular, and nervous, and the last one is connective tissue, and I think I sort of spoke about this some weeks ago. I was going to spend a lot of time on this because it sort of represents, as part of it, fascia. And fascia is playing a big role now in body work and rehab medicine as being sort of a culprit to a lot of issues that people have that bring them to us or chiros or physiotherapists. So we'll be spending a little bit of time here on this slide set. So connective tissue is everywhere, like I said. So it's one of the most widespread tissues in the body. It can be found in or around nearly every organ of the body. And the reason we say this is because of the variety of variations there are to connective tissue. We can have connective tissue that is as sensitive and soft as tissue paper webs, to very strong, resilient cords, as hard as bone, and as liquid as blood. Remember, when we define tissues, again, it's cells and the materials we find between cells. And let's also remember that when we looked at epithelial tissue, it was all about the cells, the shape of the cells, and the number of layers of cells. Connective tissue is slightly different in that there are cells obviously in connective tissue, but we're actually spending a little more time in defining connective tissue to the intracellular matrix. In other words, the space between the cells and the tissue. And connective tissue is predominantly that intracellular matrix, called the matrix. So where epithelial tissue is all about cells, we're going to discover that connective tissue is all about the matrix and what's in the matrix. So we say then that there are a few cells embedded within the matrix. And then on top of that, in that matrix, we have different numbers and kinds of fibers, fluid, and something new to you, for some of you might be new to you, is something called ground substance. So again, where epithelial tissue was lots of cells, connective tissue is actually more about the matrix. So then the qualities of the fibers and the matrix determine the structural characteristics, not the cells. Where in epithelial tissue, we said, simple was about, filtration, and stratified was about protection. Well, that was based on layers of cells and types of cells. Connective tissue, because it's about the matrix, it's what's in the matrix that defines the characteristics of the different types of connective tissue. So in some cases, the matrix can define the tissue as being important for weight bearing. In other instances, the characteristics of the matrix are to withstand great amounts of tension in multitudes of direction, or possibly in a unidirection. So therefore, because of this matrix, some connective tissue has the consistency of gel, while others are firm but flexible, while others are still hard and rigid. Now you'll notice in this sentence here, this statement, I've written connective tissue as capital C, capital T. I will be doing that throughout the slides here, that when you see CT, it means connective tissue. Now, remember that we talked about the ectoderm, mesoderm, right? In terms of those layers of development, endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. Out of that comes we say that all connective tissue arises from mesenchyme, which is an embryonic tissue that is derived from the mesoderm layer. So out of the mesoderm layer rises a tissue called mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is an embryonic precursor of all connective tissue as well as blood vessels. And it's interesting that it does that because blood is a connective tissue, so the vessels would be part of that. So mesenchyme consists of mesenchymal cells with branching thin cellular processes, a very thick ground substance, and a few reticular fibers which eventually are replaced by collagen fibers. So that's what mesenchyme is. It's not anything yet. It's going to become these connective tissues, but it starts off as this ground substance with mesenchymal cells and some reticular fibers, which eventually are replaced by collagen. So we see here in the drawing, we have the ground substance here in the light pink. Here's the mesenchymal cell, its nucleus, and of course then we have these reticular fibers embedded throughout. We can see it here as well. We see the cells themselves here in the deep purple, and we can see the reticular fibers sort of branching and filling in all the spaces. And you get a good example here of, when we look at mesenchyme, which eventually will become connective tissue, we can see that there's a lot more space between cells than there was in epithelial tissues. So this is what we talk about when we're looking at connective tissue. Connective tissue has very diverse levels of vascularity. So cartilage, which we've somewhat talked about in Clinical Anatomy 1, sort of that material that covers the end of bones at joints, especially in synovial joints, it's avascular. It has no vascularity to it, nor it's also aneural as well. Now, so cartilage is avascular. Dense connective tissue, which we'll learn an example of that is a tendon, is poorly vascularized. This is why tendonitis sometimes is very hard to get rid of, because there's not a lot of blood supply to those tissues to help heal it. And then we have other types of connective tissue that have rich blood supply. So we can see here all the different types. We've got loose or areolar here, adipose, reticular, dense, collagen, collagenous, elastic, and so forth. And we're going to be going through a number of these. But the first thing we have to talk about is the matrix, and that being this space between the cells. And what's unique to connective tissue is that what we find in the matrix is fibers. And that's what's unique to this matrix, are these fibers. And these fibers sort of define what the role is. So if we go back to, structure governs function, again, what are the structures here and how does it define what it does? And as I say, it's the fibers that sort of define that. So the first fiber we can find in the matrix is collagenous fibers, or fibers of collagen. And these are really tough and really strong fibers. And when we look at a tissue that may have a lot of collagenous fibers, they're traditionally arranged in bundles, which even makes them stronger. Now, I think I may have mentioned this in Clinical Anatomy 1, but the question I ask you is, what does it mean to be tensile? When we say that this arrangement allows for increased tensile strength, what does that mean? It means that it's strength in bending. So there's some bend to it or twist to it. Collagen allows for this because of these bundles and because of this strength. We in some cases, such as bone, for example, without tensile strength, the bone will break. So it needs to have some slight bend to it. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the body. And in fact, if any of you have, fairly elderly grandmothers or grandfathers, you'll notice when you look at the skin on their hands and their arms, it seems very, paper thin. It looks really see-through and looks quite fragile. And that's because the skin, as we get older, we lose collagen. And I know there's lots of pills out there and creams and all those sorts of things that suggest that the collagen can be replaced. It may at the short term, but fundamentally, as we get older, we start lacking collagen, and this results in more brittle bones. It results in thinner skin and so forth. So we see here in this diagram of connective tissue, we have a blood vessel running through here. We can see that there's a mesenchymal cell here. There's a macrophage, part of the immune system. We have an adipocyte here that stores fat, and then we have a fibroblast, which we'll get to here later. But this guy here, he makes fibers. But what's in this diagram as well is the different types of fibers that we can or cannot find in connective tissue. So we have an elastic fiber, which sort of speaks to itself as to what kind of property it gives the tissue. We have the collagen fiber here, of course, very tough, and we have a reticular fiber, which we'll be talking about here in a minute. Reticular fibers occur in networks. They're very delicate, and those delicate fibers help support small structures such as capillaries and nerves. In other words, kind of keeping them in place as they run through tissue so that they don't get bunched up or bent or those sorts of things. A reticular fiber is made of a specialized collagen called reticulin. Okay? One thing to think about too, hydrated collagen is actually called gelatin. This is what we use to make our jellos, and this is where kind of it comes from. We actually boil bones of animals to get collagen sort of out of the bone structures and the cartilage and create gelatin. I don't know why I have that in there, but whatever. Again, we see the reticular fibers here. The other type, the last type of fiber that we can find in the matrix is elastic fiber, and it is made of a specialized protein called elastin. What defines something to be elastic? What defines an elastic compound is something that can be elongated, but when that stress of elongation is no longer there, the tissue returns back to its original length after stretching. So, think of a rubber band that you might have. You can pull it out and make it long by stretching it between your fingers or your hands, and when you let go, it comes back to its original shape. And this is what an elastic fiber does. For example, the cartilage of your ear. You can grab your ear and twist it, pull on it. If you let go, it goes back to exactly the way it was. So when your mother used to tell you that if you play with your ears, you'll change the shape of them, that's not correct. Where do these fibers come from? They come from a particular cell called a fibroblast. And of course, these fibers are made of protein. Now, if you remember, I sort of introduced you to this earlier. We have a blast, a clast, and a cyte. Blasts make things, cytes maintain things, and clasts break things down. So a fibroblast, the fact that it says fibro, it tells you that this is a cell that makes fibers. Another structure that we can find in the matrix is something called a proteoglycan, and another is a polysaccharide chain. They usually contain glucosamine, and they are bound to a protein core. And you'll hear glucosamine used quite often in synovial fluid or connective tissue. There are pills of glucosamine that make the claim that if you swallow these pills, it makes your bones harder and your cartilage replaced in your arthritic joints. There really is no proof of that through ingestion you actually do this. But what it does do is glucosamine and polysaccharide chains, these protoglycans, they help thicken the matrix so that it ends up being a barrier. The proteoglycans also form the transparent lubricant of the joint. So synovial fluid is actually created by these proteoglycans. So again, we see in here, we're talking about all these proteoglycans and polysaccharide chains, sort of all in here. You sort of should take away from this picture that connective tissue is pretty busy tissue. There's a lot going on in it. Although, again, like usual, this artist through the textbook has put everything in the picture, and not every connective tissue you look at will have everything in it. Now, I've used the term a couple of times, and that is something that we find in connective tissue known as ground substance. It is amorphous, which means it has no body in it. So it's unstructured. And I kind of, not an exact analogy, but I say think of it as hamburger, right? Ground hamburger that kind of fills in the spaces between the cells. So this ground substance is amorphous. It fills in the spaces between the cells. And what's unique about it is that it holds fluid, and it acts as a molecular sieve between capillaries and cells. So it sort of filters how things go in and out of around the matrix and capillaries and cells. So it's important to understand that fluid. I'll get back to that in a moment. So therefore, we can say that ground substance is composed of interstitial fluid, cell adhesion proteins, and proteoglycans. Now, of course, cell adhesions gives you the impression, correctly so, this is like a glue, and it is. It sort of glues and holds everything together. Proteoglycans, I think I said this earlier, kind of look like a toothbrush. They have a long stick to them, and on the end is a brush-like structure. And those bristles on that brush actually hold molecules of water. So we said that ground substance holds water, and we find proteoglycans that trap water. Why is that important? When we have connective tissue, like fascia, that's not functioning properly, sometimes what's happened is that the connective tissue has dried out and gets stuck in its place. And without that water, it doesn't move well. So some of the techniques you're going to learn coming up in a couple of semesters, I think next semester, is you're going to be applying what are known as connective tissue techniques. And literally what you are doing in those connective tissue techniques, you are actually breaking down the connective tissue and sort of tearing the layers apart to allow water in. When connective tissue is hydrated, it moves very nicely against other forms of connective tissue. When connective tissue gets dry, it becomes sticky and doesn't function well. So this is sort of an example of this movement towards fascial issues and pain patterns and dysfunction in individuals is because of this lack of moisture in connective tissue, and therefore its inability to sort of act normal as it's going to. And as I said, we come along with these connective tissue techniques. We kind of rip and tear connective tissue to get water back into it, to rehydrate, to function properly. Now, I've kind of alluded to this a couple times. You know, we said that epithelial tissue is all about cells, and connective tissue is about matrix. But we have to remember that there are cells that are embedded in the matrix. And each class of connective tissue, when we look at the different types that we have, has a fundamental cell type in both mature and immature forms. I see here I've got a typo. The undifferentiated cell, so the cell that doesn't know what it wants to be yet, is known as a blast. I'm sorry, that should not be bast. That should be blast. So there should be an L in there. It should be B-L-A-S-T, a blast. Blasts are very mitotically active, which means they're dividing all the time. These blasts secrete both the ground substance, so out of themselves they secrete ground substance, and the fibers that are the characteristic of the particular type of connective tissue. Both the ground substance they create and the types of fibers that we find in the particular connective tissue. So when we think about, you know, connective tissue being from very delicate to all the way liquid, we have different types of blasts within connective tissue. So to make connective tissue proper, we have fibroblasts that are creating fibers. If we're wanting to make cartilage that we find on the ends of bones, then that is created by cells called chondroblasts. Chondro is cartilage. So chondroblasts create cartilage. In bone, we have special cells that create osteoblasts. So they are the undifferentiated cell that will eventually become a bone cell. In blood, we have a couple of different names it can go by. We have a hemocytoblast or a hematopoietic cell. Either of those terms are correct for these cells that create the blood parts and components. Now, once a blast creates what it's creating, you know, we'll go back to here and say whether it's creating connective tissue proper or cartilage or bone. Once that's finished and the matrix has been synthesized, then the cells resume a less active role, and they are traditionally usually called a cyte, meaning a cell, and these mature cells, so the blast is the immature cell, the cyte is the mature cell, C-Y-T-E, so we might call it a chondrocyte or an osteocyte. These cells then help maintain the health of the matrix. They no longer secrete the matrix. So blasts secrete the matrix and cytes maintain the health of the matrix. If there's a problem, such as a fracture or a break in the tissue, they can return back to their active state or their blast state to repair or regenerate the matrix if it needs to be done. So when we look at, breaking connective tissue down, it's the same as when we looked at epithelial tissue. We looked at, single layer, simple types of epithelium. Where were they in the body? What was their role? And that's kind of what we're doing here in terms of classifications. So when we look at the classifications here, it's usually classified according to the structure or the cell type and properties. The first is the ones that are the early stages developing inside mom, and these are known as embryonic connective tissues. So the first, as we just kind of talked about a bit, was mesenchyme. So it is the first definitive tissue formed from the mesoderm layer, remembering those 3 layers. We tend to find star-shaped cells in this tissue and a fluid ground substance containing fine fibrils. And as we know, they will eventually become, they are reticular and will eventually turn into collagen fibers. It arises in the early weeks, eventually differentiating into the various forms of connective tissue. But we can find some mesenchymal cells in mature tissues, and this allows, in terms of repair, an opportunity to create a new source of cells to go on to create new matrix. Another type of embryonic connective tissue is known as mucus, and it is a temporary tissue, and it too does derive from mesenchyme. And a common one, for example, is something called Wharton's jelly, which supports the umbilical cord in the fetus. So we see it here. Here's our ground substance in light pink. The dark purple here and the sort of darker pink represents the cell in the nucleus of the mesenchymal cell. And of course, here we see the reticular fibers, which will eventually turn into collagen. This is the ongoing process of mucous connective tissue. So here is the epithelial surface of the umbilical cord. So fairly differentiated cells here, making up the epithelial layer of the umbilical cord. We have ground substance in here, sort of in the gray. We have now collagen fibers rather than reticular, but we still have fibroblasts continuing to make the fibers that make up this mucous connective tissue. So those are the immature ones. Now we're going to get into the mature ones, and this is the same idea as the when we're looking at the epithelial tissue. Is what makes it up, what's its properties, and where do we find it in the human body. So the first type of mature connective tissue we're going to talk about is loose connective tissue. And when we look at loose connective tissue, the reason we call it loose is because the fibers are very loosely intertwined, sort of within the matrix, and many cells are present. So the first is known as areolar connective tissue. It is the most widely distributed in the body, and within its ground substance, it is more of a semi-fluid or gelatinous form, and is made of a substance called hyaluronic acid. This is a product that we find also in synovial fluid inside our joints as well. In loose connective tissue, this areolar, we tend to find all 3 types of fibers: reticular, collagen, and what? Anybody remember? I'll leave it with you. You have to look it back. So we see here we've got fibroblasts here, which will go on to make fibers. We have elastic fibers here, which is the one that you may have missed when I was doing the list. We have reticular fibers in purple, and we have collagen fibers in blue. You see lots of space in between everything, quite loose. The fibroblasts that we find here are flat branching cells that appear spindle shapes, and they are the prominent cell of this areolar connective tissue. We find lots of macrophages here. Now, macrophages are a specific white blood cell that is part of the immune response. They're, macro means big, phage means to eat, so they're big eating cells. The fibers in this tissue only account for a small portion of the matrix. And when you look at this tissue under the microscope, there seems to be lots of spaces. And because of these spaces, then, it does provide a reservoir of water and salts. It's one of the purposes of this connective tissue. In fact, it holds as much fluid as the entire bloodstream, which, if everybody remembers, is slightly over 5 liters of blood. This is kind of like bubble wrap. It serves as a packing material between other tissues to sort of keep everybody in place and not smashing into each other. It does bind the parts together, but allows for a lot of movements. And because it's kind of the bubble wrap, it also surrounds blood vessels, nerves, and glands. So it's quite packed in around everywhere, providing support and protection. It does form the subcutaneous tissue, so that's deep to the skin. And it is present in all mucous membranes as the lamina propria, lamina meaning layer, propria. So if you put your finger on the inside of your cheek, or along the inside of your cheek, that is mucous membrane. And so it is part of the layer of that mucous membrane. So here we see in the skin, here's the epidermis, and then the dermis underneath in the pink. And then below that, we have this subcutaneous layer, almost looks like, globs of fat. And we can see in here, we've got mast cells, we have collagen fibers, elastic fibers. So when we look at grandma's skin and it looks thin and fragile, it is the losing of these collagen fibers that we see here quite thickly that start to disappear and cause the skin to thin out. The second form of loose connective tissue is something called adipose tissue, which is what you're all thinking, fat, what we call it sort of generally. Adipose tissue is a specialized loose connective tissue. So we say it's basically areolar tissue in which nutrient storage is greatly increased. The cells that we find in adipose tissue are called adipocytes. Generally, what they are a cell membrane with a nucleus right out at the edge, and the whole cytoplasmic area is a drop of oil. So we say that these cells are predominantly oil, which compresses the nucleus to the outer portion of the cytoplasm. So think of a single cell with a nucleus, and all the rest of it's oil. Mature adipocytes are some of the largest cells in the body and are incapable of cellular division. There may be some of you here that will say, no, Brian, that's not what we're saying anymore, and I don't disagree with that. Back a number of years ago, we never thought that adipocytes actually divided and got more. We used to believe that you had a set number of adipocytes in your body, and in your very early years could be influenced. So if a young child is very overweight, it does set up for the storage of more fat in the body. And we do also know that there is cellular division of adipocytes, but that doesn't usually occur in adults until they are very, very obese, so into the 400, 500, 600 pound range. Then they will start to divide to store more. But ultimately, this is where that excess oil goes that we eat, that we don't need for the production of ATP, gets stored in these cells. So we see here we've got the cytoplasm here at the outer edge, and then one huge droplet of oil here taking up the cell. It is very cellular. So fat tissue or adipose tissue is extremely cellular. Obviously, if a cell's carrying a single drop, and we have an accumulated amount of fat in whether that be our belly or wherever, then we have a lot of cells there that are holding a lot of fat. The cells account for 90% of the tissue's mass. The cells are very closely packed together, and the tissue is extremely vascularized. So lots and lots and lots of blood vessels in adipose tissue. One of the concerns when we become overweight is the stress that it places on the cardiovascular system. And the general rule is, for every pound of excess adipose tissue you have is an extra mile of blood vessels the heart has to drive blood through. So if you get individuals who are extremely overweight, you can see how that really does tax the cardiovascular system. But we need fat. Too much obviously is not good, but we still require it. Without it, we couldn't exist without eating. And once we stopped eating, we would be gone very quickly. The other thing is, fat does help support certain physiological processes in the body. So we do need fat. Approximately 18% of your body weight is fat. If we divide it by gender, the average is 15% in men, and what may be shocking to some is 22% in women. So almost a quarter of weight in women should be around 22%, needs to be adipose tissue. When we start to lose vast amounts of adipose tissue, in females especially, this is one of the reasons why they become amenorrheic, don't have periods anymore. You require some amount of fat for female physiology. And I know that our society, quite often has us looking at, in some aspects, becoming increasingly thinner. Just remember that may result in you being increasingly unhealthy as a female. Adipose tissue can develop anywhere where there is areolar tissue. It usually accumulates in the subcutaneous tissues, so just under the skin. Although some of you may have the grandfather or the uncle or the dad who's got the ripe watermelon, the big beer belly, and if you were to pinch that skin to his muscles, you would see that there is very little fat under the skin, between the skin and the muscles of the abdomen. But why this big protuberant stomach? That's because in this situation, the areolar tissue has laid down fats in and around the organs. And frankly, as that abdominal cavity fills up with fat, it has nowhere to go but forward, path of least resistance, and you end up with a relatively protuberant abdomen. And we now know that kind of fat, that intra-organ fat, is very unhealthy for us. Direct relationship to diabetes and a direct relationship to cardiovascular disease. Adipose tissue also can function as a shock absorber and insulation. Fat is a poor conductor of heat. We also find it in bone marrow. We find fat in bone marrow. We find a particular type of fat around the kidneys because they do expose a little bit under the rib cage, so it's providing some protection there. And then it acts sort of like as a pillow for the eyes to sit in the orbits to allow the eyes to be sort of floating, shall we say. The other thing about adipose tissue, it is genetically influenced as to where it will be in each of us. So two things influence fat accumulation. The first is gender. So if we look at males and females, the storage of fat in females is different than the storage of fat in males. And the other part is from a familial point of view, if you have a certain trend in your family where there's weight in your family, then you have a genetic predisposition to carry fat that way as well. So this is just a diagram that shows a laydown of something called white fat. We can see here around the heart. Here are the blood vessels that we find in and around the heart. And because the blood vessels do lie on the exterior surface of the heart itself, the body does place fat around them to help protect them to some degree. Reticular connective tissue is another type of loose connective tissue. It resembles areolar, but there are only reticular fibers present. So we find reticular cells lying scattered throughout the fibers, because obviously they're going to be producing these reticular fibers. The tissue is restricted to particular sites, and it forms a labyrinth or a stroma, which is an internal framework that supports many free blood cells. So it allows sort of a network where blood cells can kind of hang out and live. So we tend to find this kind of tissue in lymph nodes, the spleen, and bone marrow. In lymph nodes, this type of connective tissue actually works as a filter to try to trap viruses and bacteria that are in the body. And therefore, by trapping them, then the immune response can occur in the lymph node. So you have a battle going on between your immune system and the invader that's been trapped by this stroma or labyrinth in the lymph node. And this is why, when you have a bad cold, you get the swollen lymph nodes in your neck, and they're doing exactly what they should be doing. They're trapping the invader, and you have a battle going on inside the lymph node between the invader and your immune system. So we can see we have these reticular cells here that are taking care of the fibers. We see lots of space around here with the reticular fibers running throughout and helps capture things. Here's the lymph node, and you can see again, here are the reticular cells and the fibers. As I say, it kind of acts as a filter to trap bad guys when they get into the bloodstream. The next, then, instead of loose connective tissue, is dense connective tissues. So if loose was loose, then dense obviously is dense. And there are two forms of dense connective tissues. There is regular and irregular. And the first we're going to do is the dense regular connective tissue. Fibers are the predominant element here. And dense regular connective tissue contains loosely packed bundles of collagen fibers running in the same direction parallel to the direction of the force. So if we have a force running, if we have a tube of dense regular connective tissue running from left to right on the screen, that means that we have bundles of fibers running parallel to that tube, meaning the same direction of the force. So this is where we find tendons of muscles. It is a white flexible tissue with great resistance to tension in a singular direction. So we see this wavy configuration, which I'll speak to you about here in a moment. And then we'll see that, everything's running parallel. So we could say then in this diagram, the force is traveling straight from left to right, as my arrow goes, left to right. And this fiber is running parallel to that force, and they lie in bundles parallel to each other. There are fibroblasts within the collagen, which manufacture the fibers and minimal ground substance. And these fibers in this, as we saw here, are slightly wavy. This waviness allows for extension under tension. In other words, I can elongate this tissue to some degree, taking those wavy structures and making them straighter. So we say the waviness allows for extension under tension. When the fibers are straight, they can no longer stretch. So we kind of reach an end point. This connective tissue is poorly vascularized and has very few cells. So this tissue forms the tendons and aponeuroses. And this is why I said earlier, this is why if you get a tendonitis, it's somewhat difficult to treat because you have very poor vascularization in this tissue. So this tissue forms the tendons of the muscles and the sheets of tendinous tissue called an aponeurosis. They also form the ligaments that do hold joints together, and they're slightly more elastic as compared to the tendon. But ultimately what we're looking at is an actual tendon that we see here and we see here. The nucleus of the fibroblast is in purple. We can see this wavy configuration. We can see everything running parallel here. And as I stated previously, this tissue can elongate, but only until these waves disappear and everything is straight. Now, I guess that maybe the one thing here we could think about is, when I talk about stretch or strength in one direction, it's kind of important to understand when we look at regular, and then what we're about to do is look at irregular. So if we take a tendon here, and we sort of have a tendon running this way, we're saying that the fibers run in bundles. They're running down the length of the tendon, and we know that the force is running in this direction. Now, this kind of tissue is really strong as long as the force is running in the same direction as the fibers. Now, what do you think is going to happen if I apply a force in a perpendicular way? So we're nice and strong this way with force, but are we as strong if we apply force this way? No, we're not. So when we think of injuries, a bit of a back pocket thing here, when we ask our patient, when they hurt themselves, we always ask about what is known as the mechanism of injury. I want to know what happened at the time of injury, so I get a sense of what direction the force was in relationship to the injured tissue. So it could be that there was a force placed perpendicular to the fiber direction, which could result in a tear in that tendon or an injury to that tendon that would give me a sense of what kind of damage happened. Okay? Now, if we go back here, another type that we have is dense irregular connective tissue. It's the same structure as previous, we still get bundles of collagen, but they're a bit thicker, and they're interwoven and arranged irregularly. So if we go back to our diagram here, and again, I draw the tissue here. I've got gray, so we'll just keep it as gray, or black, I guess. Now we're going to have fibers that, instead of running parallel along the force, are now everywhere. What kind of strength do you think this has, and what kind of forces do you think this can be strong against, this type of tissue? This kind of tissue can take forces in all directions, whatever it may be, in all directions. Okay? With this being irregular, a multitude of stresses can be placed on this tissue, and it will be strong in all of them. So, we say that it's the same structure as regular, except that the bundles of collagen are a bit thicker and are interwoven and arranged irregularly. So, we find this tissue where tension is exerted from different angles. So, we find it, for example, at the connective tissue part under your skin, which we talked about with epithelial tissue. You know, at that basilar level below the basement membrane, we have connective tissue. Well, we find dense irregular connective tissue at the skin, which allows stress to be placed on the skin in a multitude of directions and angles. So we find it in the skin. It forms the fibrous joint capsule around joints, which again, movement in different directions. It also forms the fibrous covering around some organs, such as the testes, the kidneys, bones, cartilages, muscle, and nerves. So we see here collagen fibers bundled up in all different directions. Here are our fibroblasts that help make the fibers, but we can see here very irregular laydown of the fibers. Here is looking at the dense irregular connective tissue of reticular region of the dermis, which is the lower part here. And again, you see how the collagen fiber is it's kind of all over the place here to ensure that the skin can move in many directions without having any damage done to it. The next type of dense connective tissue is called cartilage. And we sort of alluded to cartilage quite a bit in the lectures in other areas. Cartilage has qualities between dense connective tissue and bone. So it's not quite as loose as dense connective tissue, even though dense is not overly loose, but if you grab a tendon on your muscle, you can see how much movement there is there, how bend it can do, and the hardness of bone. So it's somewhere in between. So we can say then that it is tough and somewhat flexible. It provides resilient rigidity to structures. So it is resilient and it is rigid. Again, that's spelled wrong. And if I were to show you a piece of cartilage from a bone, and I shoved my thumbnail in it, you would see that my thumbnail would leave an impression in there, but the connective tissue is very rigid. And this is sort of a requirement for shock absorption, is one of the purposes of cartilage. It is avascular, no blood supply, and it is aneural, no nerve supply. So it is this, cartilage is what we find at the ends of bones in synovial joints. It contains large amounts of something called chondroitin sulfate and another substance called hyaluronic acid. Both of these are used to help create what eventually will become cartilage. It also contains something called chondronectin, which is a protein adhesive that holds everything together. Within the ground substance of this connective tissue, we find collagen fibers and sometimes small amounts of elastic fibers. So again, if I pushed on that cartilage where that thumb impression was, that thumbnail impression was, it would come back to normal again. Unique to this, it has huge amounts of water. About 80% of this tissue is water. And that helps that tissue to take a stress, compress it, and then the tissue will come back to its normal sort of position, not elastic-wise, it's just because it fills up with water. So we say the movement of the fluid in this matrix allows it to rebound after being compressed. And what's important about this is every time you walk, at your knees for example, when you step down and your foot strikes the ground, compression in the knee joint between the two bones, the distal femur and the proximal tibia, they squeeze together and causes compression of the articular cartilage, this cartilage, which squeezes water out. When we come up off the ground and that foot is no longer hitting the ground, stresses are taken right away at the knee, and the cartilage comes back to normal, sucking in clean water, and this is how cartilage gets its nourishment and gets rid of its metabolic byproducts. Surfaces of most cartilage structures are surrounded by a well-vascularized, dense, irregular connective tissue called the perichondrium. So, where the bones touch, where the cartilage actually makes up the joint, we don't find perichondrium there. Where we find perichondrium is at the edge where the connective tissue, the cartilage, ends and the periosteum begins. So it is through this tissue we also get nourishment to the cartilage through diffusion. Cartilage contains predominantly chondroblasts, and chondroblasts produce the matrix via two mechanisms, either interstitial growth or appositional growth. Interstitial growth is apparent during initial phases of cartilage formation. Chondroblasts divide and secrete new matrix, and this causes growth from within the cartilage. Appositional growth is found deep in the perichondrium, and the chondroblasts secrete new matrix on the superficial surface of the cartilage. So one, it causes growth from within the cartilage, interstitial, and the other, appositional, causes growth on the superficial surface of the cartilage. Both types of growth processes, whether it's appositional or interstitial, continue until the bony skeleton stops growing. So when we're inside mom and developing bone, that's where these two come into play. We will be talking about that in the second half of this course when we talk about bone creation. Because cartilage has an avascular nature to it, it heals very poorly. So the idea with this healing poorly and slowly, over a lifetime we do things to our joints, we break pieces of cartilage away, which eventually can lead to arthritic changes, and we don't notice or recognize that generally because there's no feedback, there's no pain going on here that we feel. So, we do eventually grind down this cartilage. It's just part of life. We do speed it up if we play sports and do injury, but ultimately it doesn't heal well and doesn't really replace itself well through a lifetime of use. There are three types of cartilage that we see. There is hyaline cartilage, there is elastic cartilage, and there is fibrocartilage. Hyaline, also known as gristle, is the most abundant form of cartilage in the human body. It does contain huge amounts of fibers, but are not apparent, and the matrix appears amorphous and glassy blue-white. So if we were to look at the bone, we would see it's very glassy and has a bit of a blue tinge to it. You don't really see it when you look at it with the naked eye, but of course under a microscope you would. It provides firm support, but is slightly pliable. That's what I talked about with, the impression of my thumbnail. And it is what we call the articular cartilage. So it is hyaline cartilage that we find at the ends of long bones. So hyaline cartilage makes up your shoulder joint, your elbow joint, your knee joint, and so forth. So we see it here in this blue area here at the distal ulna, the distal radius of the upper arm. Radius, the humerus, good heavens. Hyaline is a stringy patch which absorbs forces. We do find it also at the tip of the nose. It connects the ribs to the sternum. It forms the majority of the larynx. It forms the cartilages of the trachea and the cartilages of the bronchial tubes. This type of cartilage, hyaline cartilage, also forms the embryonic skeleton. So we're going to discover that bones, as hard as they are, actually inside mum start out as hyaline cartilage, which will eventually become bone. Hyaline cartilage also persists in the growth plates or the epiphyseal plates until the end of adolescence. So here we see, sort of the skeleton here is hyaline cartilage. It is not yet bone inside mum. It's not until a little bit later in development that it does. And we'll be talking about that in the second half. We can see here is a chondrocyte that's going to, a chondroblast that is going to create the matrix. So it's become a chondrocyte because the matrix has completely surrounded it. So we can see in this colored here that these chondrocytes were blasts previously. They secreted the matrix around themselves, and once completely surrounded by matrix, they stop making it and they turn into chondrocytes, maintaining that ground substance. Elastic cartilage is nearly identical to hyaline, but has a lot more elastic fibers in it. It resists repeated bending. It forms the skeleton of the external ear and the epiglottis, which is the valve that closes down every time you swallow. The other type, fibrocartilage, is where hyaline cartilage meets a ligament or tendon. So this is sort of like an intermediary between hyaline cartilage and dense irregular connective tissue. Sort of acts as a bit of a glue, can take a little bit more stress. And it is rows of chondrocytes alternating with rows of thick collagen fibers that creates this fibrocartilage. So we find where strong support and heavy pressure resistance is needed. So this fibrocartilage is what makes up the intervertebral disc that we talked about, I believe it was last week, in Clinical Anatomy 2. So we have these alternating rows of thick collagen fibers with chondrocytes. Very strong, very powerful, takes a lot of stress. We can see here again, fibrocartilage, we've got, again, the chondrocyte now that did surround itself in matrix is now turned into a cyte. We see all these collagen fibers in the ground substance, and it's used to make up this cartilage around where there's transition and heavy stresses. Here we see the collagen fibers and the ground substance all the way around as well. Here we can see the elastic fibers in this type of cartilage, which makes up the auricle of the ear or the external part of the ear and has the ability to bend and return back to normal. Again, we see all the elastic fibers here in the ground substance. The next type is bone. And a lot of times we don't think of bone as being a connective tissue because of how hard it is. But bone is, because remember, we have to look at the criteria as to how we define tissues. So this then has to have a matrix in it, and it does, with cells in it. So bone supports and protects. It does provide an area for blood formation and fat storage. So fat storage is in the center of long bones, in mature long bones, and of course we know that red blood cells are created in the spongy type of bone that we find at the ends. Bone is similar to cartilage but firmer because we have inorganic calcium salts or bone salts. So bone actually starts out as being soft. We just saw that cartilage, hyaline cartilage makes the skeleton in the embryo, the fetus. It eventually, that hyaline cartilage becomes calcified or becomes impregnated with calcium salts. And this is what makes it hard. Osteoblasts are the primary cell because they're going to create the matrix around themselves. And osteoblasts produce the organic portion of the matrix. Once the organic portion of the matrix is created, it then becomes impregnated with the bone salts, which results in what we see as a hard bone. Once the osteoblast, like all the others, surrounds itself in its matrix, it no longer produces matrix and converts into the maintenance form known as an osteocyte. So we say that osteoblasts are the primary cell that produce the organic portion of the matrix, and then the matrix gets calcified or impregnated with salts. Osteocytes then, so those osteoblasts then become osteocytes, and those osteocytes reside within the bone, within their own matrix, and they help maintain the bone. What most people don't realize, because whenever we look at a bone, it's from an individual or something that's no longer alive, we look at that bone and we see it as being a solid mass. It's hard to believe that bone is actually well vascularized by blood vessels, but it is. We see here in this configuration, we've taken a cross section of the femur. This represents hard bone, right? Compact bone, not spongy bone. We can see these rings, right? And all these osteocytes that are these darkened areas here, they were osteoblasts that surrounded themselves in this matrix that they're surrounded by, and then the matrix became infused with the calcium salts, thus making it hard. And we're going to get into this a whole lot more in the second half. Here again we see an osteocyte, which means it's finished creating the matrix around itself that eventually has become calcified. So organic material is made that then is calcified. The next kind of connective tissue is kind of atypical for most of us, and that is blood. And blood forms fluid that we know runs through vessels, veins, and arteries. It's considered to be an atypical form of connective tissue, and it is defined as a connective tissue because the blood cells reside within a non-living fluid matrix, which is what defines a connective tissue. In the case of blood, that non-living fluid matrix is known as blood plasma. So we have cells within a matrix, and that matrix is the plasma. The fibers are soluble protein molecules, but they don't become visible until we have injury, start a healing process, and form clots. So there are fibers in there, but they don't really become mature and active until we have some damage and we need to repair. Of course, as we know, blood functions to transport lots of stuff around and through the body. So this is why we call blood a connective tissue, again, because we have cells living in a non-living fluid matrix, and hence the reason why we define blood as a connective tissue. Sort of related to blood is another vessel-oriented system, so fluids traveling around vessels, and this is known as lymph. So where blood flows around the body in blood vessels, lymph flows around the body in lymphatic vessels. It is very similar to blood plasma, but there's a lot less protein in lymph as compared to the plasma that runs around in blood vessels. So we say there are various cells and chemicals which varies from one part of the body to the other. So for example, lymph nodes contain lymphocytes, and lymph from the GI tract contains lipids. But it is another sort of pathway of transportation. So blood is one form of transportation, and lymph is another form of transportation. Lymph is very involved in maintaining fluid levels in tissues. It's also very involved in an immune response when we get ill. Thanks, and that's the end of our slides for this week. Please ensure that you do go through these and study them and get ready for the midterm, which will be next week. I will talk about that this week in the other class to get everybody ready. Again, thanks a lot.